Well, welcome to our seminar today. Richard Watt was actually giving the introduction, but it didn't come out on the audio. So, it's John Fountain here. I'm just going to let you know that we've got a very interesting seminar speaker, Doug Allen from Simon Fraser University. He's going to talk to us about the Duel of Honour, screening for unobservable social capital.
Okay. Yep. Well, first off, thanks again for having me back a second time. I mean, I love this place. It's beautiful, and I appreciate being able to be here. Last time I was here, I gave a talk on why farmers always own their combines, but they don't always own their land. This is a little bit different than that one. I've been working on this economic history project for about 10 years now, and trying to understand the institutions in England between 1500 and 1850. And this is just one of the topics that popped up. And what I want to do today is I want to convince you that, first off, dueling is extremely puzzling. Its characteristics are really, on the surface, look like they're extremely hard to understand. And that I think most social scientists really haven't got a very good explanation for it. But that with a simple screening model, simple economics model, we can put all of these things together and come up with something that I think makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to start off with a trivia question for our Manitoba scholar here. Eric's been sending me emails about Homer Simpson's duel and various other duels, all erroneous stuff. So does Eric know? So here's the great province of Manitoba. As you can see, it's almost entirely underwater. But does Eric know, without looking at the map, does he know what the Churchill, actually it's not a landlocked province. There actually is a port way up here. Now, do you know who it's named after? Okay. It's a great trivia question if you ever meet a Canadian. Say, who's the town of Churchill? And there's a Churchill River there. Who's it named after? And they'll always say, well, it's named after Winston Churchill. It's not. It's named after his son, which is, there you go. But it's not the Winston Churchill of the 20th century. It's the Winston Churchill of the 17th century, who is, of course, the great ancestor of the 20th century Winston Churchill. But it's named after a man named John Churchill, who was this guy here. He was the first Duke of Marlborough, and he was the third governor of the Hudson Bay Company, which is why this port was named after him in the river. And since I only have an hour, I can't talk too much about him, but I'm going to argue that the duel was designed exactly for a guy like John Churchill, who dueled a lot. He was the son of a poor squire, Winston, who just so happened to side with Charles I, and but didn't side with him enough that Cromwell decided not to take his head off, but let him just etch out a living on a small farm in England. And when the Restoration happened, Charles II rewarded the family with the patronage appointment for the son John, who was only 15, in the Duke of York's house. But he was a very marginal aristocrat, and he worked his way up. And dueling was one of the things that he did to convince his patrons that he was worthy of their support. But his dress, no. If you were in a duel with him, he wouldn't have been wearing any steel. Okay, we'll get to that. Just some more introductory remarks here. Other famous duelists that you may not have known about: Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Jackson, two presidents of the United States, Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, the one you probably know about, Aaron Burr, Vice President of the United States under Jefferson, and his opponent, Alexander Hamilton, okay, one of the founding fathers. Okay, probably their duel being, of course, probably the most famous duel in history. If you were to look at biographies of most senators and U.S. Supreme Court people, amongst as well as presidents, things like that, most of them dueled. Okay, it was prior to 1850, I should say, in the U.S. So lots of famous people dueled. Now, there's three types of duels, and we're only going to talk about one of them. The first, very briefly, the first type is the oldest, something called the judicial duel, the trial by combat. This is a case where, Philip would have, I have a charge against Philip, and it's a way of deciding who's guilty or not. So we would have a public contest where the local nobility would be watching. This was an event that was sanctioned by the state and the church, and the idea was that God would decide the dispute between Philip and I. And the victor, God had sided with the victor, and if I happen to disarm Philip or something, then we'll decide to draw and quarter him or chop his hands off or do something like that, some kind of suitable punishment. But this was a duel to decide guilt. But I want to just point out, one, in public. Two, look at the armor that these guys have on. They got lots of defensive weapons, and they used various types of weapons. All right? Another type of duel that you've seen on movies and things is a chivalrous duel. It takes place between, I should say the last duel by judicial duel was 1808 in England, although it was long since out of practice for 300 or 400 years. This is a duel that's, again, a medieval duel. It's a sporting event. Knights participate in the chivalrous duel. They would have lances, go at each other on their horseback, these sort of thing. Again, lots of defensive weapons, completely in public, completely sanctioned by the state. This was, in effect, a sporting event. We're going to talk about the Duel of Honour, though. Duel of Honour, much different, starts around 1500. And when it first starts, it's using a weapon called a rapier. And this evolves into an épée, which is a stiff, straight, thrusting weapon that was used for piercing the opponent. Very deadly. Notice that it's in the woods. Okay, it's in private. It's actually illegal. Notice there's no defensive weapons being used. Even though it's in private, notice there's some other gentlemen standing around here. Okay? This is an interesting picture because dueling is pretty much finished by 1850. But it does last until the First World War, especially in Germany and France. And the épée evolves into this weapon here, the saber. And the saber was a slashing weapon, and it could do all kinds of damage, but it usually was not nearly as lethal as the épée. And especially towards the end of the 19th century, a saber duel was not a particularly lethal event. But this is actually a photograph. And this is a duel from 1905, and this poor chap on the bottom, that's his decapitated head sitting right there. So this was actually a fatal duel. So even with a saber, you could lose a head, and I think he died. But so there's two types of weapons. Again, notice that it's in private, but there's still other gentlemen around. This guy looks like a referee saying, "Stop, stop, don't mutilize him anymore." Whoops. And, of course, the third weapon, and the weapon that totally dominated in the end of the 18th century and the latter part, the 19th century, was the pistol duel. Again, held in private. This is a painting, and they were unlikely to be this close. They would have been much likely to be much further apart. But notice, again, the other gentlemen standing around. Okay? So that's a duel that we're going to be talking about. Now, here are the characteristics that I want you just to think about and try to imagine what could possibly explain this. So first thing, the cause of the duel was trivial. And there was no limit to the number of causes. So if I went to a party and John was there and I said, "Hi, John, how you doing?" He goes, "Yeah, okay," and turns away. He was cool towards me. That's it. It's a duel. Okay? That coolness of manner. Just you offended me a little bit. Or the one thing about the Homer Simpson duel, if you touch my face, that's on automatic grounds for a duel. If you pulled my nose or slapped me or something to that effect, that would be a duel. But there is just an endless number of grounds for a duel. In fact, there was no limit to the number of duels. And any hint that you were not telling the truth, you were lying, would be immediate grounds for a duel. So the first thing that makes a duel of honor interesting is the fact that I'm going to lay my life on the line for a trivial offense. John just turned his back a little too soon for me, and we're going to lay our life on the line. And there's going to be a real chance that we're going to die over some trivial little thing. Oops. Now, John was cool to me at the party, and, sorry? You were cool towards me. And you weren't cool at the party, you were cool towards me. And we're going to have a duel. We're going to put our lives on the line. And it doesn't matter if I challenge him or he challenges me. And it doesn't matter if I win or he wins. Our social standing the next day will be exactly the same. So I'm going to put my life on the line for a trivial event, and I don't even get a prize for winning. Right? So that's sort of interesting. It's not going to be a barroom brawl, though. I'm not going to go up to John and shove him and pulverize him before he gets a chance to do anything, or give him a right hook when he's not looking. It's going to be a strictly regulated event, And as soon as the challenge has been issued, that would set into motion a series of events where other people would start negotiating, and we would have to follow by a strict set of rules. And so one of the things about dueling that we want to explain is what's the nature of these rules. All right, so it's not a barroom brawl. It's not a gunfight at the OK Corral. It's a highly regulated event. It's always held in private. It was nominally illegal. Now, it was nominally illegal, and a lot of people claim that the law was ineffectual because there were so many duels. But the law was very effective. If you were in the class of people who were not allowed to duel, then the law was completely binding. And if you were involved in a fatal duel, you were charged with murder. If you didn't kill the person, you were charged with assault or some other kind of offense. So if I'm not allowed to duel, the law is completely binding. If I'm in the class that's allowed to duel, though, then the law was completely non-binding. I would never be arrested. If I was arrested, I would never be charged. If I was charged, I would never be convicted. And if I was convicted, I would certainly be pardoned. I mean, the only time I would be in trouble was that if I cheated, if I didn't follow the rules. The results always leaked. In fact, in the sense that I don't move up, there is no prize. I don't move up the social scale. I don't move down the social scale. But all the friends know that I lost. The fact that I lost is irrelevant. All that matters was that I dueled. You mean the outcome in terms of winning or losing? Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, those are the critical elements that depend on your social standing, not the whether I won or lost the duel. Exactly. Now here's another one. John was cool to me at the party. We put our lives on the line. We followed a strict set of rules. We're allowed to duel, so it's going to be okay, but the word spreads around. And then after the duel, maybe I shot him, maybe he shot me, or I stabbed him, or maybe we missed, or whatever. We reconcile. In fact, John comes to me with a nice card already written beforehand saying, I apologize. I mean, John, why didn't you give me the card before we put our lives on the line, right? So in fact, it was considered a successful duel when there was reconciliation after the fact. So one of the emails that Eric sent me was about how these guys would reconcile before the duel took place. Never happened. In fact, that would be considered, worse. I mean, that would be the same as not dueling once you've been challenged. So again, kind of odd that there'd be this reconciliation afterwards. Samuel Pepys in his diary has about 11 duels that he describes, and most of them are fatal. And in almost every one, the guy's bleeding to death, and the other person runs up, grabs the guy. Oh, John, you've always been a great friend of mine. Yes, it's okay. It's hilarious to read, but yeah. But you wonder, why did they go through this event when they felt this way? Yep. Phil? It's gonna be endogenous here, so we'll get to that. It's gonna be one of that's part of the things we got to explain is who was this class that was allowed and who were the class that weren't allowed. Interesting, there's two classes that weren't allowed, which might surprise you. No defensive weapons allowed, and this is part of making the Duel of Honour was made as simple as possible in a sense. You weren't allowed to have combinations of weapons. You defensive and offensive or multiple offensive weapons. I mean, over time, it's constantly making it simple. Okay, almost so that you can sort of estimate the probability of dying with anybody in general. The lethalness falls over time. So duels start out to be very lethal. They end up being pretty trivial. By the end of the 19th century, you have about a 1% chance of dying in a duel. Probably more likely to die from infection or something like that than the actual thing. Most of this lethalness happens through the choice of weapon, but it also happens in terms of the types of rules as they evolve. So, for example, in a pistol duel, just standing further apart. Begins in 1500, ends around the 19th century, so I'd like to explain that. Why was there no dueling, no Duel of Honour in 1200? Why is there no dueling in the 21st century? And finally, it was the sole domain of the aristocracy. Okay, till the very end, you got a few lawyers and doctors dueling, but it was their reign. So these are some of the facts that we want to explain. Yep. Oh, okay. Okay, so first off, I've never heard of that kind of dueling rule. Second off, as we'll see, you were never allowed to purposely miss. Okay, so that was what was called dumb shooting. Every set of rules has a rule. There is no dumb shooting. That it's the job of those other gentlemen standing around is to make darn sure you legitimately pointed the weapon at your opponent. But I've never heard of the two-stage. My guess is that's probably fiction because again, it's adding complications to the everything about the duel is designed to make it simpler and simpler. Okay, so this is kind of an annoying. Oops. So it's a puzzle to social scientists. I mean, why did this thing exist? Why did the state allow people to settle disputes this way? They had other mechanisms, so why did they allow this to exist? And I'm mostly interested in what explains all this institutional detail, all this stuff that really, on the surface, just doesn't seem to make much sense at all. There's two types of explanations that exist, none of them particularly economic. But the first one's this social historian, sort of feminist kind of approach. And that's basically that dueling is just a manifestation of male aggression. They can't help it. They gotta get it out somehow. You had these aristocrats that were in this tightly controlled society. They needed just a pressure valve release somewhere. Here's sort of a typical quote, the literature. It's what makes a man human, is that he's got to be capable of, this sort of behavior. I don't particularly like this kind of explanation, in part because I don't find it that testable. Secondly, I don't see how it can explain a lot of the institutional detail. And most importantly, it just strikes me there has to be a lot cheaper ways of funneling or demonstrating courage and aggression. If I'm the king, why do I want my nobles killing one another? I'll get them to kill my enemies, right? Or I will, maybe as a sporting event for entertainment or something. I mean, we can think of all kinds of ways to channel aggression that are productive as opposed to doing that. So that's one option. The other option, the Eric Posner kind of option, is that dueling is a substitute for courts. This one, I think, works worse than the social historian explanation. Here's a quote. I mean, in fact, every lawyer who writes about dueling just writes about how stupid it was, because they all start off, well, it was a substitute for courts, but what a stupid substitute, right? It's like having a judge who flips a coin to decide who's the plaintiff and the defendant. And, and you're going to be executed. So the duel either misfired. It was because the challenge itself was wrongful and the challenge suffered death, or because the challenge itself was correct but the challenger suffered death. Certain features are clearly ridiculous. The practice is random. It strikes some of the community's most valuable citizens, and its sanction is not proportional to its harm. Everything about the duel makes it a lousy way of being a court. So it's sort of an irrationality kind of an argument that the legal theorists have. A couple points. Courts existed right alongside dueling. It wasn't like people were scratching their heads saying, I wonder how we could stop this dueling. How can we settle this? There were courts. There were courts before dueling and during dueling. And the very people who had access to the courts were the very people that were dueling. It's the very legislators themselves who were dueling. The Duke of Marlborough had access to courts. The Duke of Wellington had access to courts, and yet they're dueling. So why would the very people with the access be the ones that were dueling? If it was a substitute for courts, you'd think it would be the poor people who were doing the dueling. And none of the institutional details really fit. So we'll see, one of the things that people try to do is randomize the outcome. The outcome had to be random. Well, why would I want a court that randomizes the outcome? Just like what this guy says, flip a coin to decide who the winner is. Okay, so what's our economic hypothesis? I'm going to argue that dueling was a screen, it was a filter, and it was designed for a particular type of class of people, what I'm going to call the marginal aristocracy. Okay, and it was designed to see if they had the right level of social capital in an era when there were these patronage positions, and that it was designed that they would have the right social capital so that they would actually be honest and behave in the interests of their patrons. So it's a screen for a certain class that I'm not sure if I can trust or not, and I'm going to trust them if they have this social capital. So let me just sort of outline how that argument works. The first thing, the strangest thing for us in here is this idea of patronage. If we were to go back to 1700, none of us would recognize the institutions that are around. There was no such thing as public service. My daughter, she's a lifeguard. She had to train for 3 years to be a lifeguard. She had to write about 6 exams to be a lifeguard. She has to recert every 2 years for a lifeguard. There was nothing like that. If you wanted to be port commissioner in 1700, then you became port commissioner in one of two ways. Either you purchased that office, and it was literally an office that was private property. And once purchased, it was like a piece of land. You could bequest it. You could resell it. You generated income from it. You excluded people from that office. Or the office was given to you by somebody else who owned the office as a patronage position. So imagine there's the king. The king has his household, which is essentially his cabinet, and he assigns as patronage appointments the various positions. So he might say, Jeremy, you are the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and you're responsible. There's a court that's underneath you, and that court has maybe hundreds of offices underneath it. You own them all. And you would say, okay, I'm going to give some of these positions to my friends, and I'm going to sell some of the other ones, and this is how you would earn a living. So if you were a judge, judges were always a patronage appointment. You would be appointed to a court, and there would be everything from the turnkey, the constable, the person taking depositions. These would be all offices underneath you that you owned, and you would generate your income from those things. So civil positions, there's no exams. You didn't need any qualifications. You were assigned these things, or you purchased them. Now, the more important the position, the more likely it was a patronage position. So higher up you went into the king's household, the more likely it was patronage. And these are the positions that we're sort of worried about with the dueling issue, not so much the purchased ones. It was a system that was based on trust. There was no direct monitoring of anybody. Okay, that you were expected to behave in the interests of your patrons, and if something came up that you had not behaved that way, you would be turfed out. So if you had a patronage appointment, you were at the pleasure of your patron. So that's the odd thing. Now, why would the patron trust his appointment? The answer is because, or our answer is, if he's removed, he loses the social capital that he has. So what's social capital? It's just a private investment that people make, but it only yields income if it's recognized by the other members of the community. So I'm going to make some investments, mostly in relationships. Maybe I make them through education or marriage or business or family or something like that. And those things yield income for me, yield services for me, but only as long as you recognize me as part of the group. As soon as you stop recognizing me as part of the group, I'm out. My investments in the social group, my social capital is worth nothing. Now, I don't know if you threw this up here, but have you seen the latest movie with Keira Knightley of Pride and Prejudice, or you've read the book Pride and Prejudice? Great book. Takes place in 1790. How many people have read it? Nobody, just 2 or 3. Okay. My son had to read it just recently for English 12 Lit, and he came up to me and said, Dad, nothing happens. Because all that happens is, Elizabeth here, played by Keira Knightley, and her sister Jane, and her other sisters, all they do is go to these parties and talk to Mr. Darcy, the wealthy guy, and they're constantly nitpicking about this. You didn't play the song right, or so-and-so didn't talk to me, or they did talk to me, but they did this, and blah, blah, blah. And, of course, Mrs. Bennet, the mother, she's managing the whole affair, and after this weekend's party, they just wait until next weekend's party. And, of course, eventually Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy get together. But there's an age where that's what these people were engaged in. They lived in a world of trust, and they were making social capital investments constantly. And out of those things came various business connections and all kinds of things. But people trusted one another because of the social capital that they had engaged in. If you know the story, the youngest daughter, Lydia, runs off with a captain in the army and don't get married. And for a 21st century person, a dad would say, and Mrs. Bennet flips out. But what is she flipped out about? She flipped out because her daughter is having sex. She's only 15. She's having sex with this man who's almost 30. No, she's not upset about that. She's just upset about the fact that the family's ruined. Our social capital is gone. We didn't play by the rules, and now all of our connections are worth nothing. That's what she's worried about until, of course, Mr. Darcy saves the day. But anyway, that's the kind of social capital we're talking about. Social capital, it's going to be difficult to observe. It's difficult to observe because it's going to depend on the quality of your interpersonal relationships. Not enough to just show up to the party. You have to actually be making connections with people. So when you're investing in social capital, it's going to be difficult to observe. And in the model, it's going to be unobservable. But in our model, your initial level of social capital is observable. Everybody knew that Elizabeth Bennet came from a family of £2,000 a year. Everybody knew Mr. Darcy came from a family of £10,000 a year. Didn't know exactly what the investments were, but everybody knows if you're born a king or born in the gutter. Okay, so we'll assume in the model that your initial social capital is observable, but your investment is not going to be observable. Now, not in the model, but I'll just sort of spin a web there. The social capital is going to depreciate over time, but it'll see the model is just a one-shot game, so it won't matter. But social capital depreciates. How does it work to encourage trust? Well, again, it's just a form of hostage capital, so if I cheat, the investment sunk, I lose it. What's the problem? The problem is because the investment is unobservable, I don't know if somebody is trustworthy or not. Okay, I can tell what you're born with, but if your social capital depreciates over time, it might have depreciated to a point where you're no longer trustworthy. Or if you're born with a social capital that's low, I don't know if you've made the right investments or not, so I don't know if I can trust you or not. So that's the problem. The problem is I can't observe this hostage capital. And that's, of course, where the duel comes in. So the duel is going to have this element. If, just like what Seamus said, if you accept the duel, then that's the screen. You get to participate in the elite society. If you reject the duel, then you're expelled and you're banished socially, and your social capital is worthless. So that's what I mean by a screen. The right people are going to be screened through, and the wrong people are going to be rejected. Well, maybe okay. And there's an infinite number of screens. So this is going to be the question of why did you pick this screen? So I'd almost rather save that for a beer afterwards, because otherwise I'll never have time. But you're right. Why do we pick this screen? That's a good question. Bottom line, I'm going to say because this screen was verifiable by the people that were participating in it, compared to almost any other screen you can think of, third-party screen. Anyway, Samuel Johnson here, he got it exactly right. In a state of highly polished society, an affront is held to be a serious injury. It must therefore be resented, or rather, a duel must be fought upon it, as men have agreed to banish from their society one who puts up with an affront without fighting a duel. So to reject a duel was literally a social death sentence. You were kicked out. You were no longer allowed to marry into that group, go to the parties. You lose your patronage appointments, etc. All right. Okay, just quickly. I mean, dueling I'm going to argue, is designed to be difficult to fake. It was designed to be easy to verify. It was designed to be unenjoyable in and of itself. Now, it wasn't the perfect thing. I mean, it had some costs. It excluded a large number of people. So in our model, you need a fairly small class for it to work. It It often resulted in death or injury, so that's kind of an expensive screen. It creates incentives to invest in dueling skills, so it creates an incentive to have sort of an arms race, which is just dissipating and costly. Oops. And you have to police the cheaters, because people are always going to have an incentive to cheat the screen and just move into the group. All right, so that's by way of a long introduction. So the model, you've got the paper. I'm going to highlight the model, break it down into the 3 parts, and but here, let me describe it. So the model is just a one-shot game. If you want to make it a dynamic game, you can think of this as the last period and just sort of build up from that. But we get 99% of our results from the one-shot game, so that's all it is. There's 2 markets. So first market is an aristocratic market, an elite market. And this is a market where there's certain gains that result from the number of people that are participating in that market. And then there's an isolation market, some payoff B. So think of that as just me working on my estate, raising some crops. I'm not allowed to enter into the elite society. People are born with different observable levels of social capital. So S1 that would be the king. And then you go all the way down to SN, that's the guy in the gutter. So people are born with these different levels of social capital, and they're observable. People can make investments in their social capital, but these investments are unobservable, and after they've made the investment, we'll just call their level of social capital SI. Now, there's going to be a post-investment distribution that's going to be, of course, different than the pre-investment distribution. And in the model, we just have this sort of assertion that if your level of capital is greater than what the king chooses as the reservation level of capital, then you're going to be honest in this elite market. If your level of social capital is less than the reservation level of social capital that the king chooses, then you're not going to be honest. Okay? So the level of reservation capital is sufficient to make you honest or not. That's just what I said right there. So that SR that the king chooses is sufficient to police the behavior in the elite market. Now, the number of people that participate depends on what we call the social cutoff level here. So it depends on the cost. And the marginal investor, he's got some S star. So there's a distribution. There's some last guy that finds it in his interest to invest in social capital to join the elite group. We'll call that last guy the cutoff social capital level, and it'll be S star. Honest elite members. Okay, so most of those assumptions don't matter. This one does matter a lot. So if I'm in the elite group, what do I gain? Well, I gain an average share of the payoffs, and I get to party with the other people in the crowd, and we'll just let the level of benefit be my social capital level. Okay, so there's 2 sources of gains for me if I'm in the elite group. I share in the benefits, and I get to party. Okay, and like the fellow Richard that was here the other week, I couldn't get a G bar, so the average is just going to be a G hat in PowerPoint. That's payoff if I'm honest. If I get into the elite group, though, I'm a pretender, and I'm dishonest, then I'm going to get I'm going to get more than the average payoff. I'm going to get my one-time cheating payoff, but I don't get to party with people. Okay, so if I'm a pretender, I don't go to the parties, but I'm going to cheat somebody as port commissioner. Okay. Okay, timing of the duels, or what Seamus was saying earlier. The king is the one making the decisions here. He picks the probability of dying in the duel, and he picks the level of social capital that allows you to be in the elite group or not. People have to decide to invest or not, and then they have to decide if they're going to duel or not. And in fact, there's another one, then they have to decide whether they're going to be honest or not. Okay, we solve it into 3 parts here, so just to break down the intuition. Suppose we started off that the social capital level was fixed. There's no investment, and it's completely observable. Okay, so all there are types. There's type 1, type 2, type 3. Then it's a pretty trivial game. The king simply is going to choose SR, the social level of capital, that makes the elite group honest. And he's just going to maximize the size of that elite group. So that's just the marginal guy. Think of this as the distribution of social capital types. The king is going to pick SR, just equal to S star here. There's no investment. He's going to pick it such that this condition is met, which maximizes a number of honest types in the group. If he picked a social capital that was too high, then this area here, those would be people that would have been honest if they could have joined the elite group, but they weren't allowed to join, and so they're sort of lost gains from trade. And then if he picks it too low, of course, these guys are in the elite group, but they're dishonest, and that's a bad thing in the model. So he just picks this. So it's pretty trivial. He picks this level. These guys are in. These guys are out. It's not very interesting. Okay, what if we let social capital is still observable, but now it's variable? So people are allowed to invest, but I can observe the investment. So kind of like it's going to be like a Klein-Leffler kind of model. So 2 stages. King chooses the reservation level of social capital. Okay. Individuals choose whether or not to invest or not. So if we start with the second stage, suppose I'm the king. Okay. So I've got a level of social capital. I'm born with a level of social capital that's bigger than the reservation level already. Well, of course, I don't need to invest. I'm already a trustworthy guy, so I don't invest. Those people that have social capital that's too low, they'll invest as long as the net benefits of investment are greater than their reservation opportunity. And the interesting thing here is you end up with this an interesting ex post distribution of social capital. So if we start off with this reservation level of social capital, in the model we just assume you just go to the reservation. These guys here are the investors, right? And so they invest just up until they get to the reservation. This is the cutoff guy, so everybody else down here doesn't invest. So in this model, you've got this sort of endogenous 2 groups here. You've got the aristocracy, and you've got the commoners, and there'll be a big gap between them. So in our model, I mean, you don't have a continuum. You can start with a continuum of types, but you're going to end up with two different groups. So, all right, but there's in both of those cases, there's no dueling, no need for a screen because the social capital is observable. So what happens if it's unobservable investment? Here's where I need a screen. I need to be able to tell of those people that were investing into the group. I need to be able to tell if they made it or not. And if I had a multi-period model and there was depreciation, I need to tell if people who capital depreciated if they maintain the investment to stay in. So, one interesting thing here is that an individual will duel and be honest as long as sort of this condition's met, where the probability of living and having the gains is greater than cheating. Turns out to have exactly the same condition as before, so dueling doesn't affect the group size in this model. Okay. Now, again, if I'm born with social capital that's too high, I don't have to invest. If I'm born with it too low, I don't have to invest. So we can just worry about these guys for the moment, the ones that are potential investors. They're going to sort of face a gain tree like this. They can invest. If they invest, they have to decide to duel or not. If they reject a duel, they're just going to get this low payout. If they duel, they have to decide whether to be honest or to cheat or not, and there's going to be various payoffs. If they don't invest, they're going to be a pretender. Okay, they're going to pretend that they're going to be they're going to be in the elite market pretending. So when they face a duel, they can also they have a choice to duel or not. If they duel, then they have a choice to be honest or not, and they're going to face different payoffs because they're going to be cheating. So the way the duel screen works is to just set the various conditions such that you get the right payoffs for the right things, and you end up with some dueling conditions. So the first condition is just going to be, if somebody's a pretender, the king is going to set the probability of dying and the level of social capital such that a pretender always rejects a duel. So if I didn't make the right social capital investment, I'm going to reject the duel. If I'm an investor, the king is going to set the probability of dying and the level of social capital such that I always accept the duel. It's in my best interest to accept the duel. He's going to do the same thing to make sure that if I'm a potential investor, I always find it in my interest to invest rather than to not invest. Okay? And okay, let me just take a step backwards. Okay. So the king's going to choose those things. If he sets the probability of dying too low, then pretenders they're all going to join the elite group, and the screen's not going to work. If he sets it too high, then the investors are going to reject the duel. So you can solve these equations here to find out what the optimal lethality of the duel is, but essentially that's what the king's doing. Now there's one problem here, and that's that the guys on the very bottom, they're not the potential investors. They always have an incentive to pretend, right? Why not? I mean, I'll go in and I'll cheat, and when I get challenged for a duel, I'll just quit. I won't do it. Or maybe I'll have an incentive to fake or do something like that. So another condition is going to be those guys just aren't even allowed to duel. Okay? So if somebody's born with a social capital level that's so low, we know ex ante that it would never pay to invest, then we're going to just not allow them to duel. All right. How am I doing for time? I got 20 minutes here. Okay. Let me see if this hypothesis explains dueling then. First thing, limits on participation. So Philip asked me earlier, what about these groups? Interestingly enough, the very highest members of society were not allowed to duel. So the king was not allowed to duel. His household was not allowed to duel. So the Duke of the Duke of Marlborough dueled all his life. When he becomes Duke, he's not dueling. Okay? So quite often the king might even step in. If somebody was allowed to duel but was still a high-ranking noble, the king might even jump in and say no. So very high-ranking officers often weren't allowed to duel if you're no dueling in the middle of battle. Oops. Now, here's the other thing. The lowest members of society were also not allowed to duel. That was what we talked about earlier. I mean, it was illegal for commoners to duel. It was only the aristocracy that was allowed to duel. And that totally fits the screening hypothesis. So we think about the distribution of social capital, right? Remember, dueling is designed for these guys in here. Did they invest? So those are the guys that are allowed to duel, right? And maybe the guys just above them because their social capital might be depreciating. But these guys, we know they're not trustworthy. So they're not allowed to contaminate the screen. They're just ruled out. These guys, we know they're trustworthy. We know they don't want to get kicked out of the group. So they don't have to duel either. So the dueling screen hypothesis predicts there should be a limit on who's allowed to participate, and that's exactly what we find. What about this one? This one should be pretty obvious now. So why was it that it didn't matter if I won or lost, if I challenged or was the challenger? The reason why it didn't matter is because dueling was just a screen. All that matters, like what Seamus said earlier, all that mattered was, did you accept or did you reject? What happens afterwards is really quite irrelevant, right? Because it's just a screen. It has no value in and of itself. Why were there limitless numbers of grounds for duels? Because I want to make sure that these investors run the risk of entering into duels. If I had, the only reason for dueling was I pulled John's nose, well, John's just, he's covering his nose all the time if he's a pretender, right? He won't let people, he'll avoid having his nose pulled. But if there's a limitless number of grounds and he's a pretender amongst us, sooner or later he's going to be, somebody's going to take offense to something that he's done, and you're an economist. That's a duel right there. So it made for the fact that every potential investor could be liable for a duel. Now, why was reconciliation common? Again, by doing the duel, you demonstrate that you are a trustworthy type. You don't reconcile ahead of time. To reconcile ahead of time is almost to announce, I'm not trustworthy, right? So again, there was no benefit to challenging, which sort of makes sense because, again, duels could be faked, right? So you and I, we're friends, and so I just challenge you, and you accept. There's no merit in that. I mean, because we're going to have a stage duel, fake duel later on anyway. So there was no benefit to being the challenger or the challenged. But why would anyone challenge? John was cool to me, and everybody noticed that he was cool to me. I suffered an affront. And so I'm obligated to challenge. That's part of the social rule here. Is there an infinite number of things that could spark a duel when we'd be challenging infinite numbers of times? Nothing but dueling. Well, And part of this was that, you know, for a certain class of people, they were engaged in a lot of duels. So Alexander Hamilton, I think that was his 7th or 8th duel. And for a guy who hated dueling, that was they were doing a lot. So, yeah, I mean, you want to be careful when you say just because there was lots of grounds for duels, it doesn't mean that there's an infinite number of grounds, and people would have to make judgments, social judgments, about whether they were legitimate or not. Well, limitless. I mean, yeah, okay. That there are a large number. In this particular game, you only have to duel once, and that's what I mean. We get 90% of the results on this model. So in a dynamic model, you would be dueling more than once, right? Because A, there's depreciation, and B, there's fakers. And so, sure, you can stage one duel, but we want you to be dueling over and over again. Philip. Almost always in public. Although, yeah. So, for example, you know, the Duke of Wellington's duel, his duel, he was the challenger. He challenged an earl because the earl suggested, it was implied in a letter that he wrote to a newspaper, that the Duke was sympathetic to the Pope. And that was the grounds for the duel. Well, for example, yeah, especially in terms of lying, although it's hard to know if I was cool to you or I touched you or, you can see accusations of lying certainly fit that way. If I perceive that people are taking it as a challenge to my social capital, yeah. Philip? Oh, okay. Anyway, the reconciliation sort of makes sense with the screen, though. You have demonstrated that you're the right type of person, and therefore you're part of the group. We can be friends again. Prior to the screen, I don't know or not. And same thing for no change in social standing. The duel itself, it was a screen. It had no productive aspects. So, again, I just love this story of the Burr-Hamilton duel. So, Burr, again, in a letter to an editor, suggested that Alexander Hamilton was not being as honest and forthright as he could, and so they had this sort of dispute. The duel is arranged. Aaron Burr is the sitting vice president of the United States. He leaves his office, goes at lunchtime, crosses the river, boom, kills Alexander Hamilton, goes back to work, right? You can just imagine Jefferson walking by the office. Hey, how's your day going? Yeah, not bad. Just killed Hamilton. Yeah, that's no problem. He finishes out his term as vice president. He's given a commission to go study the Mississippi Basin, the equivalent of sort of royal commission. That's a fiasco for him, but he goes and completes a 25-year practice of law in upstate New York. When he dies, he's given full military honors. The fact that he executed the former Treasury Secretary and Founding Father, didn't affect his social standing. Nobility. Yeah. Right. So one thing, I don't know if I'll have time to do it, but I mean, one interesting about the thing is, what's the difference between the North American duels and the European duels? In the European duels, sole reign of the aristocracy, there were limits on participation. In the U.S., there really, in fact, practice, there wasn't much of a limit in terms of participation. Virtually anybody could duel, although it was practiced among the legislators, the lawyers, the upperclassmen. Although people like Alexander Hamilton could work his way up and end up dueling. But there were lots of people that dueled. It was more common in the South, where there was more of to say aristocracy is a little pushing the term, but sort of people of consider themselves of a higher social class. It's the gentry, right, in the U.S. Now, this I find really interesting. So all attempts were made to make the probability of dying random, and that's exactly what the screening hypothesis predicts. The perfect screen is one where it's literally a roll of the dice, because One, you want people to know what the chance is that they're going to die, and you don't want people to be able to influence the probability of dying, because then I might just accept duels or challenge people for duels because I'm a good dueler, right? I'm not an investor. I'm a pretender, but I'm just a good dueler. I'm a good shot or a good marksman or a good swordsman. So you want to avoid that. So the rules were designed to get around that, and you want to avoid the arms race aspects. So rules to prevent expert or stage duels. There are a whole bunch of rules that sort of work against expert duelers, one being choice of weapon rules. So usually the challenged was allowed to choose the weapon. So if I'm an expert swordsman and I'm going around challenging people, just not because I'm an investor, but because I'm good at swordsman, you just choose pistols. Yeah. Yep. You get the there's that element. I mean, choice of weapon is not the only rule, right? I mean, so if you go through the rules, there's I mean, that's a good point. If you go through the rules, there's benefits to being the challenger and the challenged, okay, which might work in being accounting for that, moving back one step in terms of the thing. Let me just talk about some other ones. So here, no dumb shooting. So in a stage duel, right, I'm going to purposely miss my opponent. But if you did that, it was the seconds from either side would insist you just reload and you have to point. Okay? Now you have to point at the other person, but there was, these are just other rules that sort of might affect professional duelers. So anything that would make somebody nervous, or you dropped your weapon, right? You're in a sword duel and you dropped your weapon, you'd be allowed to pick it up again. If you got cut above the eyes and blood running in your eyes, then they would stop and clean it up. And if they couldn't stop the blood, the duel would be postponed. There were minimum firing rules, so these things you were, to prevent you from calibrating your shots. Fixed times, so you were limited in how long you could aim at people. Now this is an interesting one. So with pistols, and the argument in the paper for why pistols evolved was because they were easier to randomize than swords. These were very expensive weapons. They were well-made, well-crafted, but they were made on purpose to be inaccurate. So the barrels were short. Okay, they knew how to make a long barrel, but they made them with short barrels. It makes them the bullet will spread further. They were smooth bore, so they knew how to rifle barrels, but these were smooth bore barrels, which again made them less accurate. There was no aiming beads or any kind of aiming aids on the weapon themselves. So they were well made, but they were made to be inaccurate. Mm-hmm. Yep. Russian roulette, right? Just have a lottery. Yep. So that's what I mean. So why didn't the king just have a lottery and say, okay, 3 nobles are going to die this year. If you want to participate, anybody want to be port commissioner? We're just going to have a lottery. So there's lots of screens that have this, your chance of dying, that have better options than this. I'm saving it for the beer. So again, once the duel one of the rules was once the duel has been challenged, the participants, they won't meet again, talk to one another until the actual duel takes place. Everything takes place between their seconds. So they nominate a second. They're the ones doing the negotiating, right? And there's also witnesses. So witnesses are, the assistant to the seconds or something. So at those duels, those pictures there would have been a physician usually would have been there, and there would have been these witnesses and the seconds. So, and that would not have been allowed. Well, that's just the point. For a screen, that's the thing. There was no prize. It's the screening mechanism that explains the fact why there was no prize. I mean, that's one of the puzzling things about dueling, is that I'm putting my life on the line for something trivial where there's no prize. That's right. So I want to participate in the society, and I have to demonstrate that I'm a trustworthy type. If I reject the duel? But why do I want to just have a punishment in my, as opposed, not sure if I'm the king. Why do I want to? We're going to have a dueling system, but if you reject the duel, we're going to take away your property. Yeah, Phil? Then why would I have pistol duels then? I don't need any athletic ability for a pistol. No, but what's the point of target practicing with a gun that's completely, has random shots to it? No, I don't want any investments in that. Again, it's a screen. I want people, go read, go meet people, make connections with people. That's what I want you investing in. Oh, the fact that they practice, yeah, that's a bad thing with dueling, right? So that's what Eric's raising. He's saying, look, you're trying to make it random, but people invest in skills. Well, there is a game. You get if you. Oh. No, not if you really thought it was random. I mean, you had a lucky shot, right? I mean, that's the point of the duel is to avoid that kind of thinking. Yes. Oh, but the king doesn't want that though. That's the whole point. The society doesn't want that to happen. We don't want you bullying us around, even though you're not an investor. We want to know if you're trustworthy or not. We don't want bullies. We don't want people that are getting their way because they're good duelists. I think you watch too many movies. Yeah. Well, we have a meritocracy right now. Anyway, turn and fire rules, again, just a way of avoiding aiming. You got your back to the opponent. Turn and fire rules, very common. Oops. First blood rules, that's a fencing rule, but again, a way of equalizing body sizes. This is annoying. Okay, rule of seconds. I'm probably running out of time here. Just essentially to prevent cheating. So you've got multiple parties involved here, maybe 6, 7 other people involved. Their social capital's at stake. It's going to help make the duel legitimate. It's going to make collusion more difficult. Their job is to make sure the duel is legitimate and fair. Now, one interesting thing is seconds would insist that a duel take place. So if the judgment was by these group of 6 that this was a legitimate duel, even though you might have second thoughts and you want to back out, they would insist that the duel takes place. Again, makes sense because it's a screening mechanism. If you reject a legitimate duel, you lose, right? You're kicked out. But at the same time, if they felt the duel was not legitimate, it was faked, or there was some problem with it. So, for example, came across a picture of 2 dueling pistols where one of the pistols was partially rifled, not at the end, but inside. If a second discovered something like that, well, of course, he could, the duel would not be go through, and that person would have been kicked out. And their job was, in part, to make the duel public knowledge to the right people. So, if Philip and I are dueling alone, and, we're just staging it, and we go around and tell everybody, yeah, we duel. We had 30 shots each, and, luckily we survived. I mean, nobody's going to believe that, but it was the job of the seconds to make sure that the right people knew the duel. Oh, you chose your own second. Yeah. Well, that's a problem, but remember, then the second is going to choose an assistant, a witness, and there's also going to be a physician, whoever he is. So again, you get more than 3 people involved in a cartel, and it's starting to not. It's what? Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I never thought of that. This one's more of a technical one. I think I'll just very briefly. In the model, the probability of dying is going to depend on the cost of social capital acquiring. And in the Europe, where it was difficult to move up the social ranks, you don't need quite as high of a probability of dying to get rid of the pretenders. In the U.S., where you could argue it was easier for somebody like Alexander Hamilton, born in a house with no mud floor, to move up to be a founding father. And so you required a higher probability of dying in the U.S., which was the case. So in the 19th century, people estimate there was about a 7 times higher probability of dying in a U.S. duel as opposed to a European one at the same time. Here's, again, so just one final test. So if there's no patronage, there should be no dueling, because dueling is designed to make in this trustworthy environment. English Commonwealth comes along, 17th century, dueling is at its peak. There's about 500 nobles in France per year dying in the 17th century. The English Commonwealth comes along. Cromwell gets rid of the patronage system. He has a different mechanism. He institutes a whole set of exams for civil office. No dueling. Cromwell's out. Charles II comes in. Dueling comes back. So right at the very peak of dueling, we have this window where there's no patronage, there's no dueling. China never has any dueling. China has, for 2,000 years, they've had a meritocracy in terms of their civil offices. People have to write the exams, do various things, again, consistent with that. 19th century. In the 19th century, by 1860, I think the British civil service is about 26,000 people. There's no way you can have a clannish form of administration, knowing what people's, having word spread around whether or not people are investing in social capital, whether they're past the dueling screen or not, when the civil service gets that large. You've also got middle class that's rising, that makes the outside opportunities larger. Basically, those dueling conditions can not be met when that B rises. Okay, so the decline of patronage, the rise of outside opportunities, and you get the fall of dueling. Last two, women were not involved in civil office. Women were not allowed to duel. Jews, although there's a few exceptions, they generally were also not allowed to have civil office. They were excluded from dueling. Okay, so the model seems to fit those sorts of things. So anyway, dueling seems to be one of these things that you start off with by saying, that is really strange, really bizarre. And yet, this, simple screening model seems to capture, all of the details quite well, I think. That's about it. All right, well, I was just 5 minutes. Yeah, I had to skip all the good stories, but I had to